Hi everyone, my name is Billie and welcome to Casting the Net. This is a new youth-led series hosted by teens for teens, exploring the breadth and depth of our online worlds. In each episode, we'll be casting the net wide in order to learn about the opportunities but also challenges that the internet brings and hear from many experts all around the globe. Welcome to part 2 of my discussion with Professor Richard Layte from Trinity College, who co-authored a study which shows that striking the right balance in the amount of time spent online could be good for a teenager's well-being. In part 1, we talked about the research and the positive and negative impact on our well-being. In part 2, we discussed if there is a magic number to the right amount of time to spend online and what needs to be done to build on this research. But first, I begin by asking him if there are any differences between genders and how we spend our time online, and if this can have an impact on our well-being.
This is another question which we are still looking at, because if you think about it, all right, smartphones have only been with us since, say, 2006, 2008. Okay, so we don't have an awful lot of data at the moment. We only have, for example, in growing up in Ireland, we met our older cohort. We call them cohort 98. They were born in 1998. And we only met them for the first time in 2007 and 2008. At that point, some of them were getting smartphones, but only some of them. Later, almost all of them, just about everybody got smartphones. And they were the first generation to go into their teenage years with smartphones. So we can't compare them to previous generations in a sense, you know, who didn't have phones. So there's still sort of a job to be done to work out what's the effect here of being online. Nonetheless, right, there are some patterns that jump out, and the patterns seem to be that young women seem to have more mental health consequences from internet usage than young men. Young women are spending more time online, and there seems to be more consequences for their time online than for young men. Younger adolescents, those between 12 and 12 and sort of 15, 16, seem to be worse off as well. So there's a kind of, like, we call this a developmental process. You know, as you go into your teen years, what tends to happen is you stop spending as much time with your family, don't you? And you start spending more time with your peers. You start spending more time with friends. That's a natural thing. You know, it's a natural progression that people make. You start looking away from your family. You start looking toward your friend. They become more important to you as a source of fascination, but a source of information about what's important and what's not important. It's not to say you forget about your parents, but they become less important. And that's a real natural developmental process that happens. And that means that young people in their adolescence are very sensitive to peer opinions and to peer behaviors and to peer interactions. And if it goes wrong, if there are poor relationships, it can seem like the end of the world, can't it? It can seem like nothing will ever be good again. You know, like when friendships break down or when you get on badly with people, it can seem catastrophic, can't it?
I think everybody experienced it at one stage or another as a young teenager.
Yeah, it's really common. I mean, it's a natural rite of passage. And of course, as you get older, you get better at managing that. You get better at managing relationships, but also you get better at managing your own emotions around relationships. But what we do see is then, so the biggest increases in anxiety and depression are amongst teens, younger teens. There are increases amongst older adolescents as well, and amongst young adults, but they're not as profound. Haven't been as sharp. But it definitely seems to be something which is affecting young women more than young men. Does
your research show us the right amount of time to be spent online? As it might be an odd question to ask, like, because it's what is the right amount of time to spend online, but does it have a suggestion, I suppose, is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, it'd be nice to give you a sort of simple answer to this, all right, but again, I have to hedge my academic bets and tell you that What we have are observational data. So we can observe people's time online, and we can observe its consequences in terms of the kind of well-being of young people, mental health of young people, physical health of young people. And we see that as people go above about 1 to 2 hours a day online, you begin to see more symptoms. But also when they're doing no time online, there seems to be some symptoms. So that would suggest, wouldn't it, that more than one or 2 hours online seem to make things worse. And above three or more hours, it seems to accelerate in terms of number of symptoms. But as I mentioned earlier on, much depends upon what you're doing. So if you're online and you're talking to your friends and you're having a really good laugh, well, then it's probably not going to be bad for you. You know, it's almost like having them in the room, chatting away to them, or being on the phone to them. It's no different to that. In that sense, then being online is not going to be a problem. And that's not going to be too much of an issue. Similarly, what you're doing might matter as well, mightn't it? So if you are browsing all of these people online and looking at their lifestyles and feeling upset because you haven't got that lifestyle, or feeling that you're left out because they're doing things with other people and not with you, well, then that can be a bad thing, you know. So that again can have ill effects. Same thing with sleep. If you're online late at night and you're not getting to sleep, then that's going to have a bad effect on you. So I hate to make give you a complicated answer, but more seems to be worse. Okay, so like all things, moderation is better, but moderation of certain kinds of online activities, which are usually more passive and more about sort of looking at what other people are doing and comparing yourself to them, they seem to be bad things.
So there's no simple answer, but that makes total sense. It's all about moderation, I suppose. Yeah. So then, would you like anything specific for us as teenagers to take away from this conversation and the research that you did?
Yeah, what I have always found in the past, okay, is that information and knowledge helps. I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm an academic professor. If I didn't believe knowledge helped anybody, I wouldn't be doing my job. Yeah. So what I do know is that when I teach this, okay, as a course in Trinity, young people are very interested in it, first of all, okay, so there's a lot of engagement with it. But also, when you ask them at the beginning and then at the end about their behaviors, a lot of them have changed their behaviors at the end. They've changed what they do online. They started limiting themselves and being in terms of the time they're spending, and limiting about the kinds of things they're doing, and they're monitoring themselves and they're looking at their own reactions. And I think that is a good takeaway here, that, you know, to do these things knowingly, be aware of the effects that it can have on you, and where things make you unhappy, well, maybe try to, reduce those. It's like anything, isn't it? Eating donuts. I love donuts. Donuts are lovely. But I do find that after my 5th or 6th donut, I tend to feel bad, right? And knowledge of that means that I reduce my consumption of donuts. So it always helps to have knowledge about this. So if we can help young people to understand the dynamics of the internet and online time, then that will help them to protect themselves, because it's a really complicated environment. I don't. You know much more about this than I will. I'm a bit of a dinosaur here, and I'm not very good online. I barely got a Twitter. I have a very small Facebook presence. I don't use Instagram at all, right? So you'll know much more about these things than I will, okay? But the evidence suggests that some platforms are much more addictive than others. So Instagram is very addictive. Snapchat, pretty addictive. Facebook, pretty addictive. And they've designed it that way. They've, the Meta or Google, Facebook, these companies have spent a lot of money and a lot of time making those platforms as addictive as they can be, to make sure you stay there and you stay engaged, and their advertisers can sell you stuff. And it's important to know that, important to know how you're being manipulated so that you can protect yourself and adopt patterns of behavior that lead to better outcomes for you and not better profits for Meta and for Facebook. Yeah. You know, that's a really important thing. It's also important to look at some of the research out there that's looked at this. There's a woman called Rennie Engelin who has done a lot of research on, women's body consciousness and the way that our society seems to spend an awful lot of time comparing women's bodies, getting women to compare their bodies to other women's bodies. What do I look like? It's not our body. Our society tends to prioritize not what young women know, not what young women do, but what young women look like. And that can be quite damaging. And what Rennie Engelin's research has done, and she's done some really lovely experimental research on this, what she's found is that particularly Instagram creates focus on the body and the face, whereas other platforms like Facebook don't do that as much. Snapchat is nearly as bad as Instagram, but not quite as bad. And I think that's important for young people to know about, that this platform is distorting the way you see the world, and that can have negative consequences for you. So that's something I think young people should be aware about. There's also sort of broader issues here as well. This is, in a sense, we've been talking about this as academics would call this a health behavior. Now we're talking about it like, my analogy there to eating donuts, or an analogy to doing exercise. It's like a health behavior, isn't it? And in a sense, we're trying to forewarn people with education and better knowledge so they can protect themselves, just like we would do around diet, exercise, smoking, drug use, all of these things. Information helps. But there's also the fact that young people need to be out there in politics and in the public domain, influencing the way that the government regulates and structures access to the internet, and the behavior of large corporates in online spaces. These are within our realm to be able to change, to moderate, to limit, and to organize in ways that benefit the population rather than being detrimental to the population of young people. And young people need to be out there like you are, and well done to you and all power to you, with organizations like Webwise, making sure that young people's voices are heard and that organizations, governments do the right thing, so that we promote well-being, we don't undermine it.
I couldn't agree more. It does all come down to really awareness, and at the end of the day, teenagers know better than anyone how this should be run and what way would be more beneficial to us. And then, Richard, what do you think parents can learn from this? Like, what advice would you give them when parents of young teenagers who are going through this world that they never got a chance to go through really as a teenager?
As I mentioned, I have 3 kids, and this is a constant issue for not only for me, but for lots of parents of young people. You want the best for your kids. You really want them to be happy. You don't want them to suffer the consequences of online time. But on the other hand, you don't want to stop them doing things that they enjoy and which might be beneficial to them. So helping older people, helping parents to understand how the internet works, what the dynamics are of online time and behaviors, helping them to understand where there might be problems, but also where there might be benefits. Again, this is going to be very important, and it's something that there needs to be more discussion about. And parents need to be forearmed so that they can know how to do the right thing. Having said that, they also need to have good relationships with their children, don't they? Communication matters. And back to my point earlier on. So parents who have good communication with their children and children who have good communication with their parents have better outcomes. We always find this. Being able to discuss issues openly, being able to talk about when things bother you, when you're upset, looking for support, but also looking for advice, and sometimes being able to sort of tell parents when things aren't as they should be, and when parents are maybe doing the wrong thing, and discuss that with them. That's really important for better outcomes. So in many respects, I'm sort of giving you exactly the same answer that I gave you to the previous question, aren't I? That this is pretty much about trying to regulate our time, parents regulating their children's time online, not only via the knowledge that they are forearmed with, but also with their communication with their sons and daughters, to understand what they're going through and what might benefit them, and to help them to manage their time online. Parents can't be there on their shoulders all the time managing them. Parents always have this difficulty that their advice is only put into effect via the activities of the young person and through the young person's own decision making and activities. And therefore, it comes down to young people communicating with their parents to be able to find the best way of behaving, and then parents trusting that they'll do that, and helping them and being open to them when it goes wrong.
That's exactly what I would have said about communication. Is definitely the key to a good foundation for something like this. So I have one last question then before we finish up.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think should be done to build on this research? What would you like the future to look like, I suppose?
We do need more research. As I've suggested, we're still pretty much groping around in the dark here, trying to work out what good evidence for how these dynamics work and how these effects might work. So we do need to do more research, but we already know quite a lot. And we do know that we're going to have to do a couple of things. So the first one is about regulating online spaces and having real consequences when large companies, or anybody does the wrong things online. So that means that we need to have bodies which are enforcing standards online. So where there is content which is damaging, which is libelous and scandalous, which is harmful to young people, then that needs to be removed, and there needs to be an authority which can remove it, and if companies or organizations don't remove material, then there needs to be consequences for them, and there needs to be people responsible for it. So luckily there is indeed a piece of legislation going through the Oireachtas at the moment that would produce this is sort of like a broadcasting standards body, but for the online spaces. And this would introduce greater ability to bring organizations and companies into line with online material. Having said that, companies themselves, I think we need to have long conversations with companies about their practices, because often here commercial practices run directly contrary to personal well-being, and we don't allow, for example, companies or organizations to freely distribute harmful narcotics, or to distribute alcohol, or to distribute tobacco, do we? We regulate these things. We regulate what age people can access them and who can use them. And we need to be thinking of similar things here, I think, online. So there's a great deal of work to be done, and I think some clear thinking to be done about what kind of issue is online access. Is it more similar to smoking and alcohol than it is to something like diet? Like there are things that we try to control in diet. For example, additives in food that we can't see, supplements in food that we can't see, because people need to be protected against those things. But nonetheless, by and large, we let people make their own choices, don't we, about what they're going to eat. And then we try to give them public health advice about what might be better or worse for them to eat. So we need to think about this around online behaviors. We need to think, what kind of behavior is this? Is this something that needs to be really strongly regulated, as I've suggested? Or is this something that we will largely educate people about and try to give them information? And I suppose the simple answer would be we're going to need both, and we probably need to have stronger online regulation than we do now. And there's an ongoing argument about whether the piece of legislation that's going through the Oireachtas will be strong enough on this front.
Brilliant. Perfect. Is there anything before we finish up that you'd like to say, or have I covered all bases?
No, I just say thank you very much for all your questions this afternoon. Look, really, really nicely done. So thank you
for
very
your
much.
time.